And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Network, on Progressive Radio Network, on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and at opednews.com/podcasts. My guest for this show, my repeat guest for this show, is Pulitzer Prize and Emmy-winning Chris Hedges. He was a New York Times foreign correspondent for 15 years. He's a columnist for Truthdig, and his new book is America, the Farewell Tour. Great to have you back on the show, Chris.
Thanks, Rob.
So before we get into discussing the problems which you explore in your book, I'd like to start with you discussing what gives you hope and what are your thoughts about hope?
Well, I don't embrace the mass culture Disneyfied idea of hope. I come out of a religious tradition, and I think Daniel Berrigan, who I knew when I asked him to define faith, said it was the belief that the good draws to it the good, even if all the empirical evidence around you says otherwise.
That's hopeful.
We oftentimes, I was a war correspondent, and it was a very dangerous profession, whether in El Salvador or in Bosnia. Armed forces, in the case of El Salvador, the military; in the case of Bosnia, the Serbian paramilitaries would go into villages, carry out massacres, block the roads, attempt to stop the press from getting in. We would go in Bosnia with our satellite phones in our backpacks. Oftentimes, as we got close to where the massacre had taken place, Serbian snipers would fire at us. 45 foreign journalists had been murdered, had been killed by the time I got to Sarajevo in 1995. So you go in, you document it, and it's always a kind of Pyrrhic victory. But it doesn't allow them to commit atrocity and take human life without it being recorded. But we knew, if not the next day, someday soon, we were going to get up and do the same thing again and again and again. I was in El Salvador for 5 years. I was in the former Yugoslavia for 3. So I think when you grapple closely with systems of oppression and you build relationships with the oppressed, you stop asking that question because it is such a primal survival struggle for survival. I teach in a prison. As a matter of fact, I'm leaving tonight for my first class. So, I don't share the consumer culture's mania for hope, which I think is just a form of disempowerment. It stops you from confronting corporate power, the forces that have eviscerated our democracy. That is also true in terms of the inability on the part of the wider culture to confront the reality of climate devastation, which is now threatening the extinction of the human species. So I think hope, as it's used in the culture, is really a way of disengaging, not a way of actually embodying what I would consider hope. When David Talbot interviewed me for that book Unspeakable, he asked the same question at the end of the book. And I told him a story about teaching a student in prison. I've taught in prisons now for 10 years through the BA program at Rutgers. So they're earning their college degree in prison. And this guy had been from Camden, New Jersey, had been arrested, I'm certain, for a crime he did not commit. He couldn't read or write, and forced to sign a confession. The police just didn't want to investigate. He's held for 2 years in the county jail till he's 16. He's tried as an adult. He's not eligible to even see a parole board until he's 70 years old. So he's a brilliant student. He's now 39. And at the end of one of my classes, he waited behind. He was my only A+. And he said, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I study as hard as I do because one day I'm going to be a teacher like you, and he walks out. That embodies hope for me.
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Because it's transformative. It's the power of the transcendent. It's reaching out, affecting another life in a profound way. Did that particular moment put a dent into the most important or the most egregious civil rights issue of our day, which is mass incarceration? No. And yet I can live off of that for a really long time.
Okay, so you don't buy the kind of mainstream model or version of hope, but you have your own version. So talk more about what that is. What is your version?
Well, it's precisely that. It's the belief that the good draws to it the good. It's the belief that, as I've often said, I don't fight fascists because I'm going to win. I fight fascists because they're fascists. That we are called upon to confront forces of radical evil and trust that in that confrontation it's meaningful, even if all of the signs around us says otherwise.
Okay, because I asked this question because your writing is devastating. It's brutally true, but it's hard. It's hard to digest it, and so I think that your ideas about hope are important in terms of helping people to see a way to respond.
Well, I mean, all revolutionaries, whether they come out of a religious, Che Guevara or anyone else, they're possessed with what Reinhold Niebuhr calls sublime madness. You are going up against incredibly powerful monolithic forces that look unassailable, fueled by an ideal or a belief. And that's what revolutionaries, and most of them don't succeed, we forget, throughout history. But if you're not possessed by that, then there's no starting point.
I just went to the Museum of the American Revolution in Philly. Have you been there?
No, I missed that one.
It's worth going to. I was really surprised about how they've documented so many of the different people who played a role, and how there were so many factors and forces involved in the American Revolution. It really gives you a lot more to connect with, to grab onto, to understand the idea of revolution and how it happens. What aspects of revolution do you think we need to be looking at here now?
Well, let me go back on the American Revolution, because that was essentially the white slaveholding male aristocratic elites throwing off British control, and a huge factor in that was that they wanted to take possession of Native American lands. They had been blocked by the British. Thomas Paine, who represented that radical undercurrent within the revolution, and he was only allowed to do that because in Pennsylvania, all of the American leadership sided with the British, so there was a vacuum that he filled. But once the revolution was over, he was rapidly shunted aside, even defamed and attacked within the press because he was an abolitionist. He called for a guaranteed minimum income. One of the things I find is this deification of the quote-unquote founding fathers by the left is a misreading of history. Howard Zinn understood that in The People's History of the United States. They were terrified of direct democracy, which is why they created all sorts of mechanisms, including the Electoral College, which is still with us, to thwart that possibility. It's why they made sure that huge segments of the society, women, African Americans, Native Americans, white males without property, were disenfranchised from the vote. And what democratic space existed in this country was carried out by radical and popular movements, the suffragists, the abolitionists, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, that opened up the space. We were never designed. In fact, the American system, in Aristotle's strict definition, has and remains an oligarchy. So I find that our popular interpretations of the revolution, and in particular the counter-revolution that was led by figures like Alexander Hamilton after independence, are not given the kind of scrutiny that they should in order to understand the system that we live in. We just saw Hamilton on Broadway. Yes, it had a multi-ethnic class, but Hamilton was the father of American imperialism and the U.S. banking system. He was not a positive force. Certainly Paine did not consider him a positive force. And that was a long digression, but I didn't want to.
No. It's really important. I agree with you. I think the history of the United States that we need to pay attention to is Zinn's history, the people's history. Right? And that's the one that should be taught in every school, and hopefully it is more and more. And so that's a good sign.
Well, I teach it in prison.
Talk a little bit more about your prison work. I mean, we'll get to your book, but I really think that it's exciting what you do. So you're teaching through working with Rutgers?
Yeah. So these are students who are working on their BA degree. And I teach all sorts of stuff, history, and I taught Les Miserables last spring. I taught a history course called Conquest. We read Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins. I helped my students in one class write a play that last May was performed called Caged at the Passage Theater in Trenton, which was sold out every night. Of course, most people in Trenton have direct experience with mass incarceration. We had one night just for the families of the students who wrote the play. And I have that upper kind of maybe 2-3% of the prison population that turns their cells into libraries. They're some of the best students I've ever taught. And I've taught at Princeton and Columbia and other places. I'm serious intellectuals who are not studying to network or go to Goldman Sachs, but because they truly care about the life of the mind. I mean, including the student I just mentioned. Some of these students are certainly going to die in prison.
Yeah, it's incredible work. It's very powerful. So I wanted to also talk about evil and human kindness. You've talked about that. Where does evil and human kindness, narcissism, psychopathy, the culture of the self, of idolatry, where do they fit in to your view of the world?
Well, in that sense, I come out of Christian anarchism, where power is always the problem, that one is, in that sense, an eternal heretic. And that the corporate coup d'etat that we've undergone has, in theological terms, if we look at the environment, the commodification of human beings, this is idolatry. It's about the culture of death. It is destroying the barrier reef and the great sequoias and extinguishing lives around the planet. It is, and to use Immanuel Kant's phrase, it is radical evil, and that in that sense we are called to not only fight it but destroy it. The chances of us destroying it are marginal to zero, but that doesn't in any way absolve us from our duty or requirement to battle on behalf of the forces of life. We are watching the breakdown of American society. The rise of a figure like Trump is not accidental. That's what happened with the breakdown in Yugoslavia. It's what happened with the breakdown of Weimar. You vomit up these particular figures, these demagogues, these con artists who speak in the language of destruction, speak in the language of hate. They're incapable of creating anything. They confuse destruction with creation. in that sense, they've walked over onto the other side and embraced, what in theological terms we would call evil.
And what about the role of narcissism and psychopaths in our civilization today?
Well, the entire consumer culture is narcissistic. It's built around the cult of the self. Even spirituality is a form of narcissism. How is it with me? It's all self-focused, self-centered. It's about self-gratification. It's about hedonism. And of course, this is a recipe for despair, what Emil Durkheim calls anomie. And that's what the book is about. It's about these pathologies that are rippling across the American landscape because of the rupturing of social bonds. This hyper-individual is very individualism, which is the fundamental ideological tenet of neoliberalism and corporate capitalism, is, to use a theological term, very destructive to our soul. And of course, it's about the attempt to achieve, to acquire an unachievable happiness, either through buying experiences or buying things, or an unachievable self-actualization. And it keeps us disempowered, and it keeps us in despair.
Disempowered? How's that?
Well, because you're not building a collective, you're not organizing. The focus is always on the individual.
So, I call my show The Bottom Up Show. I've been calling it that for going on 11 years now. And I believe that we're transitioning to a more bottom-up culture from a more top-down one. And I think that the individualism that you describe is part of this top-down culture. And we need to go to learn from indigenous people to get a better idea of what a collective bottom-up way of relating to each other in the world is. And you write about this in your book. So talk a little bit about that. How is it? What is a more bottom-up collective way of relating with each other, of functioning in the world that that does not disempower us?
Well, it's socialism. I mean, it's about recognizing that the health of any society is defined by its commitment to the most vulnerable within that society: children, people with mental disabilities or physical disabilities, the poor, the elderly, and that the more, as we have done, you shunt these people aside and treat them as if they're human refuse, the crueler your society becomes. And we have become a very cruel society. So Kropotkin, when he writes about, it counters Darwin on the myth of survival of the fittest, points out correctly that's just utterly incorrect, that in the animal world, those who survive have the highest rate of survival function as herds. And when a member of that herd is attacked or wounded, it is the protection of the herd. It is working as a collective that ensures our not only psychological health, but even our physical well-being. And that's certainly within indigenous cultures. I mean, capitalism always defines itself by what it's against, because what it stands for is so naked in its greed and its hedonism and its narcissism and its exploitation and its abuse. So you get that with communism, you get that with the war on terror, and as we subjugated and killed the Native American communities in the United States, the Native communities were painted first by the Puritans as satanic, as barbaric, as forces of evil that had to be conquered and crushed. And of course, what they were challenging was not just indigenous communities that were attempting to defend their land, but an ethic, a communal ethic that stood in stark contrast to capitalism itself. So it wasn't just the crushing of native communities, it was the crushing of this ethic, this other way of relating to each other and to the natural world.
And yet some of their values did come into our Constitution. Jefferson got to know, I think it was the Iroquois, and they had a method of government that was incredibly civilized and way advanced of what we have, really. Certainly their treatment of women. So, you know, what I'm thinking from our conversation so far is that revolutions don't finish things. They start things.
Well, it depends what kind of revolution it is.
Okay. Go on.
It depends whether it's violent or it isn't.
Go on.
Once you create a violent uprising, then those who have access to weapons and a penchant for violence dominate. That's what history has shown. Most revolutions are non-violent, as all of the theorists of revolution have pointed out, Crane Brinton and others, that one overthrows a ruling elite by essentially having sections or segments of that elite defect to the other side. That happened in Russia when the Cossacks were sent in to crush the bread riots and then join the rioters. That is part of, and yes, violence is often a part of revolution, but go back and read Lenin on anarchist violence and how detrimental it was to building the revolution. What you had after the Bolshevik Revolution was a counter-revolution led by the Bolsheviks and the armed Red Guard. So I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. Yes, they got swallowed up in the Chicago School and neoliberal economics and all that kind of stuff. But you saw, especially in countries like Czechoslovakia, these people like Václav Havel and Dinsmore and Klaus, and they were mostly artists and poets. And so it depends on it's always the systems of oppression that determine the response. So when you shut down, for instance, in the war in El Salvador, you had huge nonviolent protests by student and labor groups, peasant groups. And then in 1979, the Salvadoran military set up machine guns on the roofs of the buildings in downtown San Salvador and fired on everyone. So peaceful demonstrations were impossible, and it spawned an insurgency. But this is examined in detail in my first book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. That even once you embrace violence, even for a supposedly just cause, you're not freed from the poison of violence. So for me, violence is always tragic. Violent revolutions. Look at the French Revolution. What did it end up with? It ended up with the dictator Napoleon, who said, "I am the revolution." And this is my long experience with and writing about violence informs this.
So your book and you do not call for violent revolution, you call for peaceful revolution.
Yeah, because that revolutions that are violent, always end up in a kind of revolutionary dictatorship, because the kind of people who are quite skilled at using violence have a kind of certain pathology. This is what makes Che such an interesting figure.
Che Guevara.
Yeah. But he was Fidel's chief executioner, both during the insurgency and afterwards. So, and at the same time was an intellectual. But he kind of reminds me of Robespierre. So, it's. I'm not a pacifist. I covered the war in Sarajevo, that we were surrounded by Serbs forces that if they broke through the trenches around the city would have massacred a third of the city and raped the women and girls and driven the rest of the people into displacement or refugee camps. And that wasn't conjecture, because we'd seen them do that in the Vukovar Valley and Mostar and all sorts of other parts of Bosnia. So at that point, you had to pick up a gun, but it doesn't. The people who were running the defenses of Sarajevo largely came out of the criminal class.
So we need to do a show ID now. So for the video, we already did a show ID. So I just need a pause so I can edit it in for the radio show. My guest for the show is repeat guest, Pulitzer Prize and Emmy-winning Chris Hedges. He was a New York Times foreign correspondent for 15 years. He's a columnist for Truthdig, and his new book is America, the Farewell Tour. Here's it. So, you know, in my research for the book that I have coming out in May, the Bottom-Up Revolution, I've concluded that a big part of our problem is civilization. Civilization brought us the top-down kind of a system that we have that brings hierarchy and slavery and patriarchy and domination, and that empowers narcissists and even psychopaths to take greater and greater power. It's kind of like there have been books written about how technology bites back. Well, civilization is humanity's biggest piece of, quote, technology that it's ever created, its biggest invention, maybe, outside, along with the corporation, perhaps. So what's your take on where we are, where civilization is nowadays?
Well, I would look at Joseph Tainer's Collapse of Complex Societies, where he looks at the collapse of 24 civilizations. Civilizations are cyclical. They have periods of birth and growth and maturation and then decline and death, and we're no exception. The difference is that when we go down this time, we'll bring the whole planet with us. There are no new lands to go exploit. There are no new indigenous communities to kill. We have poisoned the earth. The disruption of the climate, the melting of the polar ice caps. I mean, 90% of the greenhouse gases are still trapped in the oceans that we've emitted. And now we're waiting for these quote unquote burps of permafrost. I mean, so we are replicating the death of other civilizations. The problem is it's planet wide, and it's not going to be possible to walk away for very many people, if anyone. Yeah, civilizations are self-consuming. They empower a hierarchy that at the end retreats into the Forbidden City or their gated communities or Versailles, lose touch with reality and drive the society over the cliff. And that is exactly what we're watching right now.
Have there been any examples of civilizations that didn't do that, that were not self-destructive and so damaging to everything around them?
Well, no, because they'd still be here. No.
So I think Daniel Quinn wrote a book, Beyond Civilization, and I had a conversation with him. You know, he wrote Ishmael. You familiar with him?
No.
No. I said, maybe that's what we need to figure out, is what's after civilization.
Well, if you read climate change reports, it's called extinction.
Extinction. That's not a very preferable solution. You know, I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. He wrote the book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was ranked one of the 100 most influential books of the 20th century. And in The Hero's Journey, the hero starts in an ordinary world and then gets a call to adventure, and eventually stuff happens that drives him or her to cross the threshold, accept the call to adventure, and do something that changes things so that he can come back or she can come back and save the world. And so the most famous one story is probably Star Wars. Luke Skywalker gets an invitation from Obi-Wan Kenobi to go help rescue the princess and save her forces. He turns it down. He says he has to help his aunt and uncle harvest their farm stuff. And the next day, Darth Vader kills his aunt and uncle. And he goes, okay. So what do you think will be the call after the people of this world have so many times said, I'm too busy running the farm to deal with the problem at hand and respond? Will there be some kind of a call that will get them to cross the threshold and become participants in a nonviolent revolution that you advocate for?
Well, first of all, let's go back and examine Campbell and Star Wars. That's exactly the hyper individualism that I just condemned.
And by the way, I want to say that I've interviewed Chris Vogler, who wrote the book, The Writer's Journey, discussing how there should be a collective hero, how that same model could be applied to a whole people doing it. And I think that is where I think it should go. But you're right. You're right.
The whole concept of individual heroism is,
I agree,
very problematic.
But I'm framing it in a way that it would be a collective response.
Right, but the problem, Ella Baker addressed this issue during the Civil Rights Movement. As soon as you elevated figures within the movement, King maybe being the exception because King loathed that position. He didn't want to accept it. He wanted to get out of it. But it's dangerous to create those kinds of hierarchies within systems of resistance, because it essentially builds leadership cults, takes away moral autonomy. And I think this whole, I covered war for 20 years, so I don't like the word hero. I'm not even sure what it means. I'm not even sure I believe in it. We have to look to, let's go back to indigenous culture. Who were the leaders who were respected? Sitting Bull, these figures, they were people who didn't hoard for themselves, didn't operate autonomously, who were the most, all of the kind of opposite individual characteristics that we see within a capitalist society, and who were willing to engage in acts of personal self-sacrifice on behalf of their people. But again, I have that problem with Campbell, that he comes out of this individualistic culture, which I think makes the corporate state quite happy, and of course disempowers the rest of us. In fact, if we're going to build movements, and look, we see it with the Yellow Vests in Paris. It's and this Occupy it's got to be non-hierarchical. It's got to be, and it's not, and it can't devolve into a kind of personality cult, which the left is just as capable of doing as the right.
Absolutely. I've had so many conversations with people on the left who criticized Occupy because they wouldn't come out initially with a policy. And, and the fact is that Occupy was a great example of the future of how change is going to happen. It was done using a kind of a horizontal approach. Marina Citrin was great at describing it, where everybody had a voice and everybody had a say, particularly focusing on the non-white males. Because, right. And that was so important. And I think that's something that shows up every now and then, where women of color will basically say, hey, don't let that old white guy talk first, because I think we need to, we need to change that. But still, what is, I do believe that, and I agree with you about the hero. That's why I did the interview with Chris Vogler, talking about an alternative way of thinking of heroism. Because I think the idea of not standing for the way things are and taking action by either doing something that you haven't done or by stopping doing things you've already done, which is the essential element of crossing the threshold in the hero's journey, I think that's an important thing that we need to do. Wouldn't you agree?
Sure. But so much of what's going to affect real change is going to be anonymous, unrecognized, caught up in incremental acts of compassion and empathy and human kindness. This is what George Eliot gets in her novel Middlemarch. That's what finally moves the world. Vasily Grossman makes the same point in Life and Fate. Look, the myth of the hero, which is fed to us across the cultural spectrum and is the staple of Hollywood and everything else is part of the problem.
I agree. I love to give the story of Dan Ellsberg, his inspiration to go out and do the Pentagon Papers. He went to a talk by a anti-war protester who was going to go to jail, and he heard him speak, and I forget his name, and it's not important, the name, because the fact was he was just one of hundreds or thousands of anti-war protesters who were arrested and who went to jail. But this one spoke, Ellsberg heard him, and he was inspired to take action because of hearing that story. If this guy can do it and take a risk of going to jail, so can I. And that, to me, is in a nutshell what we need to do.
That gets right back to what I just, the way Berrigan defines faith, that the good draws to it the good.
Absolutely. And Howard Zinn and Woody Guthrie have both said that it's millions of tiny acts, small acts that are going to change things.
That's it.
Yeah. So, and I think that what that says is that, yes, this is very daunting. Maybe we'll lose, but you personally can do something today, tomorrow, once in a year that can make a difference. And you never know if your small act is the act that inspires somebody in a place where they have the power, they have the influence to do something that can shift the plate tectonics of the future, really.
That's true.
Yeah. Now, your book, it's a rough read. I mean, you go through different individuals and talk about them. Like, for example, the woman who becomes an addict, becomes a prostitute. It's hard to read that, really, but it's a story that happens within a couple of miles of me living in the Philadelphia area. You talk about the addiction to drugs, and that's part of her story. You talk about gambling. Tell us the big picture of the book and what's the message of the book.
Well, it's when societies break down, when these social bonds are broken, when people feel their lives have little meaning, when they live at subsistence level, and we're talking now well over half the country, when their communities are physically shattered, the way communities have been shattered under austerity, then people engage in pathological behaviors that are self-destructive. And that's opioid, sexual sadism, gambling, suicide. And the root cause of this is the rupture within the society. And until we address that rupture, these pathologies will not only not go away, but as the economic situation deteriorates, they will proliferate. And Trump is a product of these pathologies. He's the face of these pathologies, which include hate crimes and hate groups. And as Durkheim says, people who seek the annihilation of others are driven by desires for self-annihilation. So the idea was to say, if there's a broad arc to the book, it's that we live in a deeply diseased society, and until we name that disease and address it, none of these behaviors, what sociologists call diseases of despair, are going to go away.
And two things. One, Durkheim is one of the inspirations for this book, so maybe it would be good for you to talk a little bit more about him and his ideas.
Right. He wrote a book called On Suicide in 1897. I like him very much as a sociologist, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, because they reported when Du Bois writes The Philadelphia Negro, which is this study of urban life for African Americans in the North. I think he's interviewed over 1,200 families by the time he's done. So Durkheim does the same. He goes out of the academy into the street and asks that question: what is it that pushes individuals and societies to carry out acts of self-annihilation? And so he finds in his research that people who live within communal structures, for whom social bonds are strong, are able to ward off the kind of despair that leads to acts of self-destruction. And the rupturing of those bonds inevitably lead to the kinds of behaviors that I chronicle in my book. So Durkheim kind of pioneered that understanding, and that book was obviously a very important book for me when I set out across the United States, roughly a dozen states over 2 years, spending time, as you pointed out, with heroin addicts and gamblers, families that had lost people to suicide, and hate groups. I was up around or outside of Binghamton one night around a bonfire with the Proud Boys and Knights of the Alt-Right. But yes, Durkheim was kind of the engine that pushed me to do this work.
And what we know is that this manifests itself throughout our culture in so many different ways. There's growing evidence that the psychiatric drug business is a big part of this, that the answer to treating chronic problems like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and long-term depression is exactly what you described Durkheim offered as the solution, which is a collective community support of the people, not by drugging them.
Where you have the capacity for self-actualization and a sense of self-worth and belonging and dignity. I mean, I quote Pope John Paul II. I'm not a huge fan of John Paul II, but his encyclical on work is very, very good. That work is not about the exchange of labor for wages. It's far deeper and more important than that. I mean, in that thing, he said, stable and meaningful work is kind of the bulwark to holding the family together, which of course is true. It's an amazing encyclical. If we don't recapture that communal structure, which was always weak in the capitalist democracy that we live in anyway, but if we don't rebuild it or recreate it, then especially as we barrel towards another economic meltdown, the monsters are really going to come out.
Now, you've said that our only response now is sustained mass acts of civil disobedience, and it's got to have a spiritual dimension, like Standing Rock had one. What we are fighting for is the systems of life, the sacred, and the understanding that there are people and things around us that have a value beyond a monetary value. Makes sense to me. Are there underlying systems of belief? You referred to spirituality and how so much of our spirituality today is individuality and I-centered. Are there models of spirituality that tie in with this collective approach of sustained mass resistance?
Yeah, it's called active resistance against radical evil. That is, and Martin Luther King actually wrote quite movingly about this at the end of Strength to Love, that's when you find the power of the divine, if you want. It's in confronting those forces of death, not making sure you have a balanced and healthy lifestyle and meditate.
No, I'm thinking of someone like William Barber, as somebody who is in the spiritual world, as somebody who's talking the good talk. Are there churches? Are there spiritual disciplines or paths that people can pursue that you think would help get them to that place instead of the what we have? And I would also be interested in your take on the Christian Zionists as well.
Well, it would be building communal structures to resist, that we're going to find, spirituality is not a word I particularly like, but you will find a sense of meaning, a sense of worth, a sense of purpose through acts like that, rather than catering to individual needs. And I'm not saying people shouldn't ever cater to individual needs. I disappear every summer and backpack for 5 weeks because of it in places with no cell phone service or internet service. But I think we've just upended. We've allowed, or religious traditions have allowed the hyper-individualism of the consumer culture to infect religious thought.
Well, the most dominant religions have basically evolved to serve hierarchy.
Yeah, it's not like once they became institutionalized, there's quite a difference between the Christian church up until Constantine in the 3rd century and Aquinas and Augustus and everyone else who essentially, clever theologians who were used to justify institutional power. We have to separate the institution. Every institution, as Paul Tillich, the theologian, said, is inherently demonic, including the church. But I think when you look at the core value systems of religious thought, there are remarkable similarities between what it means to lead the religious life, what it means to do good in this world, whether that's Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim or Jewish, or there's far more that unites these belief systems than divides them.
And what about Christian Zionism?
Sure, it's just an offshoot of Christian fascism. It is the way fascism within the United States has cloaked itself, fusing the iconography and language of the state with the iconography and language of the Christian religion, upending the belief system. I mean, the whole prosperity gospel is heretical. These figures like Joel Osteen, they are heretics. The idea that Jesus came to make us rich, you don't have to spend 3 years, as I did at Harvard Divinity School, to figure that one out. The idea that Jesus blessed white supremacy. I mean, Jesus wasn't even white. Jesus was a person of color. The Romans were white. The idea that the gospel of Jesus Christ would embrace American imperialism in the Middle East. I mean, these are heretical beliefs. And unfortunately, the liberal church, I guess, in the name of tolerance, which is a word Martin Luther King never used, gave them a kind of religious legitimacy they shouldn't have. I look at them as, I wrote a book on it called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I didn't use the word lightly.
And you also wrote a book, The Death of the Liberal Class. What's the role of liberals and liberal elites in where we are right now?
Well, the self-identified liberal elites, the figures like Clinton's, aren't liberals, of course. They speak, Obama the same, they speak in that feel your pain language of liberalism, but assiduously serve corporate power and have sold out the very people they purport to defend. And that, I spend almost 300 pages in the book explaining how that happened, but it's a faux liberal class.
And, I recently had on as a guest Michael Yellowberg, who teaches indigenous studies. I met him at a conference on kind of saving the earth at Omega. And he talks about colonization and decolonization. Where do they fit in to your thinking?
Well, we've all been colonized, so that would be correct. We are colonized by corporate power. Obama was, as Cornel West says, the black mascot for Wall Street. That's what they do in Africa. I worked in the Congo. So Mobutu is working on behalf of the French and the Belgians. I mean, that's why they assassinated Patrice Lumumba. So, we have been colonized. Read Elizabeth Anderson's book, Private Government, which is a good little book. It's based on the Tanner lecture she gave at Princeton, but it's about what life is, the despotic life that most American workers live under the thumb of corporations. 80% of the workforce having their rights, their ability to speak out, they're monitored. I mean, if you work for Bloomberg, who may run for president, you carry around a chip. And if you talk to another person in the room for more than 30 seconds, or you're wasting the company's time. We're completely surveilled within the workforce environment, just as we are in the wider environment. So we live in a kind of species of corporate totalitarianism, which China has kind of advanced, but more than we have, but to which we are heading.
And you talk about that there's a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion.
That's John Ralston Saul's phrase, but yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah. What do you think about happiness?
I mean, ask a parent about happiness. A good parent. I mean, you sacrifice a lot for your children, which is antithetical to the cultural idea of happiness. And yet, I think for a good, conscientious parent, that there is happiness in the ability to recognize, as most parents do with the birth of their child, that it's not about them anymore. It's about their child. I think that is what happiness is. It's the, as Tolstoy says, it's the ability to live for others. That's the only real and endurable happiness.
I've gotten into happiness a lot. I actually organized the first conference on positive psychology and optimal functioning, and I got into it because I discovered by accident what made people have heartwarming experiences, what touched their hearts and gave them a glow. And I found that was one of them, one of the most important ones, sharing with your children, with your parents. But another one was personal growth too. And you described that earlier, that kind of arc of character growth. So,
well, I'm quite critical of the positive psychologists. There's a chapter in my book, Empire of Illusion.
I'll talk about that.
Well, it's a longer discussion. We've only got 7 minutes left, so buy the book and read it. But the positive psychology movement is used by corporations, and they have huge contracts. Corporations do huge contracts with positive psychologists because, to boil it down, they bring them into the environment and they say there's nothing wrong with the environment, it's you. You've got to fix yourself. When in fact, of course, it's the environment.
Well, that's why
the military hires positive psychologists.
That's why I can't get the founder of the guy credited with founding the field, Martin Seligman, on my show, because I've published articles criticizing him in his work with the military, which is problematic, certainly. Yeah.
Well, to put it mildly.
So let's see, we've got a couple minutes. I've got 3 more pages of questions here. You talk about Trump as a cult leader.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, you've got to understand him as a cult leader, because once you do, then you can make sense of his behavior. That people who are in a cult want their cult leader to be omnipotent. So when he does all these vulgar and egregious acts, or makes these distasteful, mendacious statements, it has no effect on a cult following, which has been disempowered and sees in the power of the cult leader an expansion of their own personal power. And once you apply the rules of a cult leader to Trump, then you can begin to defy him. But printing corrections of all of his lies in the New York Times or listing them on CNN isn't going to have any effect at all.
And you describe cult leaders as narcissists.
Right. All cults are personality cults, and which can come on the left as well as the right.
Have we seen that on the left?
Oh, Mao, Stalin, sure.
Okay. You opine the divide between the left and workers who have supported Trump, and suggest that to overturn the corporate state will have to begin locally, which is a very bottom-up idea. Can you talk more about your thoughts on how that would look? And
it's got to build around issues, raising the minimum wage, universal health care, things that affect everyone across the political spectrum. We're not going to argue these people out of their ideology. It's magical thinking. It's like, at the end of my book on the Christian right, I came to the conclusion that the only way to break the movement is to reintegrate these people into the economy and give them some kind of stability. And they have retreated into magical thinking because they can't cope with with a reality-based world. It almost crushed them and crushed their families. And if we don't address what's happening within that reality-based world, we aren't going to blunt this movement. And Trump is just a kind of offshoot of the Christian right, who were peddling magical thinking and fighting quote-unquote fake news and believing whatever conspiracy. Trump embodies this kind of breakdown within a huge segment of the American population that's just unplugged themselves from the world around them. And even understandably, although it's dangerous, because the world around them was unremittingly hostile.
Okay, so I recently took a dive into the values of conservatism, and two of the core ones are an antipathy towards collectivism and celebration of individualism, which are two of the same coin. It seems to me that if we're going to challenge conservatism, we need to deal with that. And do you have thoughts on how do we get people thinking more along the lines of socialism and collectivism and rejecting individualism and the narcissism that's associated with it?
Well, since they control all of the media platforms as well as the entertainment system, it's extremely difficult. Because
we already agreed everything's going to be difficult. So keep going.
Well, but I mean, I speak out. I've been pushed to the margins, but I speak out. But you have this, we are bombarded. Oprah, that's how Oprah became rich. You can be anything you want to be if you just focus on how extraordinary you are, this kind of Tony Robbins kind of stuff. And as Gramsci understood, culture is a form of domination. And that's why being literate in education is so important. And that's why the corporate state is working hard to make sure that certainly the bottom half, if not 3/4 of the population, is barely functionally literate. That's why slave owners would execute a slave if they found out they could read. As things get worse and worse, and that's why Betsy DeVos is privatizing schools or turning them over to Christian fascists. This is an assault on the education system. And of course, the tragedy is that the public school system in the United States was one of the crown jewels of our capitalist democracy, and it's being rapidly destroyed. But it is so, people don't think. This is what STEM is about. It's about teaching people from an early age what to think rather than how to think. And that, of course, has now reached the university level as we are watching the humanities wither away.
So how do we change it? How do we get people to start seeing individualism as...
That's why I write books. I mean, I am under no illusion that millions and millions of people are reading it, but it's why I write a column every Monday for Truthdig. It's why I do what I do.
And that's why I do these interviews too. So
right.
Give us some solutions. Give us some things that an individual can do to move us towards a more collective world.
You have to look around there, locally where you are. Is there a pipeline going through your community or near it? Are you watching out for undocumented workers? Are you organizing low-wage workers in fast food restaurants and the laundry industry and Walmart? I mean, there's plenty of injustice if you just turn off your screen and step out your door. But don't do it alone. You got to do it with other people.
And where do you find those people?
They're out there. I mean, you got to build relationships the old-fashioned way, which is face-to-face, not electronically.
So you need to show up somewhere where you can find other people.
Don't do it on Facebook. Ain't going to work.
Facebook, yeah. Okay, so let's wrap. We've got 2 minutes left.
Well, read. I don't own a television. I don't want them to give me, I don't want the dominant culture to give me the language by which I speak, even in opposition. I mean, for instance, if you oppose the war on terror, if you parse it, it's still a tautology. You can't have a war on terror. And it's important that we begin to, and this is why Chomsky is such an important intellectual, deconstruct the rhetoric and the language the dominant classes uses as a form of subjugation. And that means for me, I have 5,000 books plus in my house. I read 2 to 3 hours a day. I don't have I'm not on social media. I don't have a Facebook page. I'm not on Twitter. I don't have any of that.
So you've got to let go of some of the technology.
Well, you can't be entranced by, as Derek Jensen calls them, their electronic hallucinations.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? Chris, you're a hero to me. And who are some of your heroes?
a lot of the Berrigans, King, Malcolm, those figures who, spend their lives defying systems of radical evil. And in the case of Malcolm and Martin, paid for it with their lives.
So when you're listening to this, you can be a hero too, and you don't have to go out and do things like Malcolm or Martin did. You can just become a part of something and make things happen. Thanks so much,
Yep.
Chris.
Okay.
The guest for this show has been Chris Hedges. He is the Pulitzer Prize and Emmy-winning writer, former New York Times foreign correspondent, columnist for Truthdig, and his new book is America: The Farewell Tour. Thanks so much, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Rob.